Okay, so like basically everyone else, I'm obsessed with the Barbie movie and the sweater to the point where when it showed up on screen in the theater, I blurted out, I want that. And I thought it would be really funny to make it into a punch needle wall hanging. I don't usually do tutorials, but I can very safely assume that other people would also want to make an I am kenough wall hanging, or at least want to see my creative process. So let's get started with it. So I used my iPad and Procreate to draw my pattern, and since we're punch needling this, I mirrored my reference image first. I traced over the lettering and then made my own rainbow gradient by scribbling some colors and then liquefying the layer. I then opened up the image in Photoshop and marked guidelines, splitting the pattern into an 8x8 grid. Why did I do this? Well, it's because I drew up an outline for my pattern on my monk's cloth that measured 16 by 16 inches with an 8x8 grid as well. So now I could easily draw up my pattern by using the grid to see if the lines and positioning are correct. If you're recreating something for a punch needle project, and you're like me and you want to make sure that your pattern is as accurate as possible, I recommend doing this. I used an 8B pencil to sketch out my pattern because it makes nice dark lines, and then went over it with a black Sharpie. And because I was just super impatient, I only drew the background after I punched the letters, so you'll see a bit of sketching after I've started punching already. So I used two different sizes of the Oxford punch needle, the 13 and the 14. Both take worsted weight yarn, but the 13 makes slightly taller loops for when you want to make something stand out. So this is exactly why I used it for my lettering. I always start with outlining the letters first, making those stitches smaller to provide like a nice border and good definition. I take a bit more liberty with filler stitches, but I still tend to keep them on the smaller side. I also used wool rug yarn for this. If you're making this wall hanging at home, you can use whatever type of yarn that you'd like. It's going on a wall, so yarn choice matters less. But I will say that if you want to make this wall hanging into something like a rug or a pillow, wool yarn will make it last way longer. Now, I had a little bit of a problem because I was missing 3 out of the 7 background colors for this wall hanging. Normally, I would do all of the background outlines first and then fill them all in, but I only had 4 colors and I wanted to get this video out super quick. So, it was time to improvise, adapt, overcome. I outlined the sections for the 4 colors I had first. I outlined these twice with small stitches so that the different colors could be nice and defined, and so that none of the monk's cloth backing would show at the edges when I would hem later. And every single time after I punch a big section, I turn over my work and snip off my ends of yarn to match my loop heights. I also poke my loops around so that they're in the right place. When you're punch needling, you work from the back, so sometimes your loops will punch through other loops and make your piece a little messy. So it's very important that you snip and poke your work so that it looks nice and clean. It's also important to take your time while punch needling. All of my clips in this video are sped up and cut down. I actually spent a lot of time on this. Once I completed my outlines with the colors I had, I got started with filling them in. So I started by filling in some of the smaller blobs and lines just so I could get them out of the way and not accidentally punch over them with another color. I then moved on to bigger sections, starting with the colors that appeared least in my wall hanging, like purple and light blue. And then 2 days later, I got my missing yarn colors. 2-day shipping is an absolute blessing, and I am forever grateful. I started once again with punching the outlines first. I didn't outline some of these sections twice, mostly because I was just really tired, and I just ended up doing it later. Oh, also, another thing that I forgot to mention is that some of the letters have the background colors poking through from behind, like the holes and the G and the E. I make just enough stitches in those to hide the monk's cloth, because if I make too many, I find that it just looks a little overcrowded. But yeah, once I got all of my outlines done, I went back to filling in sections of the background, starting with the smaller ones and then moving through with bigger sections. For sections with narrow parts, like this pink corner, I section off my pieces using my punch needle to cut off the corner just by punching through the narrow part. This just makes your punch needling cleaner because you don't have to keep making U-turns with your needle in tight corners. It's super annoying. Along the way, I'm continuing to snip and poke my work to make sure that all of my loops are exactly where they're supposed to be. You're not seeing any of those clips here right now because I don't want to spoil how the final wall hanging looks. The next step after punching the wall hanging is to hem it. I hemmed this wall hanging by doing a metered corner. So first I steam pressed it by placing a wet towel on my wall hanging and then ironing it so that it laid flat. Next, I marked a 2-inch border and 1.5-inch corners around my wall hanging and then cut those out. The reason I cut out the corners was so that they could be hemmed flat to match the sides. I folded the corners in and then ironed them, and then I did the same thing with the sides, and then I folded the sides in once more and then ironed those again. Ironing isn't really mandatory here, but I just think it makes it easier to pin and hem your work. I wish I had longer clips on hand to pin the corners, but I just worked with what I had to hem. I used frayed strings of monk's cloth and an embroidery needle to whip stitch my wall hanging. I recommend watching Amy Oxford's tutorials for more detailed instructions. I've linked them in the description, and I basically learned everything I know about punch needling from her books and videos, so I highly recommend checking her out. Once I got to my bottom 2 corners of my wall hanging, I stitched them together and then took my needle under the cloth to the next side to continue whip stitching. Once I got to the top 2 corners, I only stitched them up about halfway and then stitched the top side normally, and I'll show you why I did this. So I kept the top 2 corners partially open so that I could insert a dowel to hang up my work. This is a great trick because you can remove the dowel if needed, and if you don't want to remove it, it'll stay in place without glue. I then cleaned up my wall hanging by using a sticky roller to remove any large bits of lint, and then a battery-powered lint remover to remove any smaller bits of lint and pilling and stuff like that. I braided some white rug yarn and then tied it to the dowel so that I could hang up my work. Okay, so here is the finished wall hanging. I'm kind of obsessed. If you want to make this into a rug instead, you can just stitch up all of the corners and then add some non-slip underlay. Easy peasy. By the way, the reason why this is on the floor and not on a wall is because the lighting here is really nice, but it'll be going up on my wall afterwards. But yeah, thanks for watching. You should like and subscribe so I can keep making more cool and fun things like this. And comment below what else you'd like to see from me. It'll literally take you a second. You won't be wasting any energy. Okay, I'm gonna stop now.